Hi, and welcome to Take Every Thought Captive, our weekly look at the Catholic intellectual tradition and an exploration of the author's books and topics that have shaped Catholic thinking for 2,000 years. My name is Jason Gale. I'm joined this week by Dr. Richard Bulzacchelli, our lecturer in theology at Catholic Studies Academy. And today, as we get started, I want to first invite all of our listeners to please hit that subscribe button, hit the notification bell so that whenever we release new content, it immediately gets put into your inbox or wherever it goes out there in the interwebs. And please share all of our content with your friends and family if you find it useful. But as we get started today, our topic is going to be that of it's a topic that's taken from Dr. Bulzacchelli's most recent class on ecclesiology that he's teaching here at Catholic Studies Academy, and all of our courses are there on our website. And we're pulling out a topic from his course there on the church, and we'd like to discuss it. And I think it's to me it's a super interesting topic, and that is the topic of communion. What does it mean to be in communion with the church? Because we have many different understandings of communion, and a lot of times it can become a very hot topic. Especially if, particular politicians, let's just say, hypothetically, of course, that, certain politicians come around, or, so we can look at the idea of communion with regards to belief in that way, but also, with regards, how do we look at our Protestant brothers and sisters who are not in full communion, but they have valid baptism. And so today what we want to do is kind of just explore this idea of communion and how we can better understand it and better understand the beauty and the glory that is the Catholic Church, and why as Catholics we should strive to bring others into full communion, that really is the goal of evangelization, is to bring people to Jesus Christ. And to bring people to Jesus Christ is also to bring them into the Catholic Church, that the bride and the bridegroom are not separated. The two have become one. And so, Dr. Bulzacchelli, maybe to get us started today, maybe you can just kind of give us maybe a broad kind of beginning of how do we understand this topic of communion, and maybe give us some points of wisdom from the Catholic tradition.
Right. So let's start with the problem, right? The problem is that we are not in communion.
Yeah.
And I think that that may seem, you might say, well, sure we are, right? I mean, like, we're all friends or whatever.
Yeah.
But let's actually start with reality.
Sure.
Right? In Scripture, one of the points that's made very, very early on is that something went horribly wrong in creation, right? So when God makes the man and the woman in the garden, he makes them in communion with one another. The two are one flesh, blah, 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 right? And we see that, he makes human beings to kind of image himself, to be his own image in the world. And God, as we know in particular, right, with particular, I don't want to say clarity, that's not quite the right word, but with particular certainty, right? We know in the Christian faith that God is himself, in his own simplicity, a communion, right? A communion of persons. So this creature made in his own image and likeness, once it sins, it falls out of communion. It basically falls apart. It falls to pieces, right? And you see numerous examples of this in the Scriptures. One is the story of the man and the woman in the garden, where after sin, they separate from each other. They see themselves as being naked in a different kind of way than they were before, right? Not naked as vulnerable and transparent toward one another, but instead naked as exploitable, right? As somehow taken advantage of, or easily harmed. And for that reason, they make loincloths for themselves out of the fig leaves, and they hide from one another and from God among the trees in the garden. right? So, and then when God comes looking for them, the man points his finger at the woman. The woman you put here with me. She gave me the fruit, and so I ate. So he doesn't trust God, and he doesn't trust the woman, and he's separated from his own nature because God made him to be in communion.
Yeah.
Right? So it's a real disaster. Another example is the story of the Tower of Babel, which begins with the idea that humanity at some point they spoke the same words about the same things, right? They were,
Hmm.
like St. Paul would say, of one heart, of one mind, of one prayer, right? This is a picture of a pre-lapsarian world, if you would, right? In
Yeah.
this, if you think of the story that way, but because of their hubris, they try to climb to God, right? They try to claim the things of heaven for themselves without waiting, as at Pentecost, right, for the Holy Spirit to come of his own accord and give himself on terms that he defines.
Hmm.
And in this hubris, right, they let us make a name for ourselves, right?
Yeah.
They all collapse in upon themselves, and this tower they build in their pride comes crashing down, and God confuses their languages, right?
Hmm.
And now essentially they're all different cultures, all different individuals, all different languages, and then they're in alienation from one another. So that's the starting point, right? And the word that we've kind of used to describe that condition is original sin.
Hmm.
So, right, that's what we call it, right? Original sin. And this has to be overcome. We find in Christianity, right, that the answer to overcoming it, the definitive answer, right, not just a partial answer, not just a provisional solution, right, but the full solution to this problem is to be made one again
Hmm.
in the new Adam, which is Jesus Christ, the new man who binds together the totality of humanity in his own person, right?
Yeah.
So in himself, he is the peace between us. That's basically what communion in the church is, being made a member of the body of Christ, and in that, being made whole again, being restored to what we ought to be as human beings.
Yeah. And
Not
that's
only
a,
that, but being brought into real communion with God himself, right? An elevated state where we enjoy intimacy in God's own inner life.
yeah. And I think that's a huge point to that. I mean, you can contemplate for the rest of your life on is that communion that you enter into when you are baptized into Jesus Christ, like it's not symbolic. It's not a dedication. It's not a promise of how you are going to live, that you're going to be, I will forever be, the apprentice, or I will forever be just, a friend of Christ or a follower of Christ. No, you are literally in communion with him. That is a reality. Now, again, it's an unseen reality, so it quickly, I think, falls from our minds easily. Um, but that is a real reality. And again, like you said in the beginning, this has to do with salvation. And this communion is just absolutely key. So that reality that is there with that.
Right. So I think this helps us to understand, the idea then, which many find offensive today, right?
Yeah.
Outside the church, there is no salvation.
Yeah.
If you think about that in positive terms, so sort of let's just not why dwell on the negative aspect of it, right? Which is
Yeah.
what we're inclined to do. Outside the church, there is no salvation. So you're telling me that unless I'm in the church, I'm surely lost. Well, in a certain sense, I am saying that,
Sure.
but let's look at it from the positive point of view, right? The way we see it in John's gospel is you're already lost. I mean, like that's the de facto human condition.
Yeah.
The solution to that problem, right, is to be made one again, to be
Yeah.
brought into communion. You're in alienation now. The ultimate, most radical manifestation of alienation, right? When alienation reaches its term, we call that death and ultimately hell,
Hmm.
right? So what do we know about the dead? Just look at it from a human point of view. Leave aside the sacramental question. Leave aside what we know from the effects that Christianity has upon death for us, right? Leave that aside. Let's just look at the guy who dies. What do we notice about the dead people in our lives? That we don't see them anymore. We can't talk to them, right? They don't come to Thanksgiving dinner. I mean, the problem with being dead is that you're cut off from everyone you know.
Yeah.
Right? And that's a problem that everyone recognizes cross-culturally, right? Now people have different kind of they wonder about death, and
Sure.
they have different hypotheses about what else there might be to it. But it seems to me that one of the universally recognized issues with death is that it presents this massive problem.
Yeah.
We're cut off from the people that we love, right? That needs a solution.
Yeah, and it's a solution that also has to fulfill a desire that I think is within each and every person of eternity, right? There's a certain desire to, we understand our death, but we want to somehow, because even the secular atheist enjoys the idea of leaving a legacy, right? Of, so even within I think the secular atheist, you have this desire for eternity. What was the name of that? There's a good book. What was that? A Severe Mercy by Sheldon Van Auken. Good book, but he and his wife wrestle with this idea of eternity and mercy and things like that. But so I mean, like, this, whatever this solution is, I think it has to, like you said, it has to solve that problem of death, but I think it also has to fulfill that desire for eternity there. Like, it's not just a simple okay, whenever you die in your subsequent deaths, you just simply do this and ta-da, it's done. But there's this longing that has to be fulfilled in that.
Right. So the thing about, I guess my point is to think about this idea of the necessity of the church for salvation, right? As almost a tautological assertion.
Yeah.
Right. So basically, I want to say the problem is you aren't saved. The problem is that you're broken. You come into the world broken. That's just the doctrine of original sin. That's all I'm asserting there, right? Is the doctrine of original sin. We come into the world.
I will say, sadly, that's a big assertion today.
Today it is a big assertion, but it's classical Christianity, right? It goes back to, I mean, certainly it's been part of the Western Catholic tradition since Augustine. And I don't think Augustine is just sort of pulling it out of thin air either. I mean, it's obviously he's wrestling with a major problem, right? I mean, the basic issue that he's trying to identify in this doctrine is something that he already sees as having been given in the faith, right?
Sure.
So yeah, the problem is that we come into the world not knowing God, not loving God as we ought, not being in communion with each other, but instead being in a sort of adversarial state, or prone for our relationships to kind of disintegrate into an adversarial state.
Mm-hmm.
That's not good, right? If we want to live as we really ought and to manifest the image of God as communion,
mm-hmm.
right? Then that alienation has to be overcome. That alienation, which ultimately resolves in death
mm-hmm.
and hell, has to be transcended. Where is it transcended? In communion with Jesus Christ, right? And that's what we mean by the church.
Yeah. And that's and it's almost like when you hear that, or when, I think when a lot of people when they may use that phrase, outside the church there's no salvation, it's like skipping the first part, or to me it's like skipping the first part of the conversation and jumping to almost the punchline, because you, even Catholics, they hear that and they're like, oh, that's That's
Sounds
kind
so
of
severe.
judgmental. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
that's pretty intense. We don't
Yeah,
believe that anymore, do
judgmental.
we?
I like that word.
Yeah. Yeah, but no, the first part of that,
Triumphalistic is another one.
yeah, you zealots. Like, but no, the first part of that, sentence, or the preface to that should be that Christ is the solution of sin and death. Christ has bound himself to the church. Outside the church, there's no salvation. So, when we get into that, but again, even within, when we look at, okay, so how are we connected then to the church?
Yeah. So I think that I think where a lot of this issue, I think where a lot of this issue comes, sort of collapses for people, right?
Yeah,
Is in the fact that the church absolutely has a juridical aspect,
yeah,
right? And so when I say outside the church there's no salvation, one of the things that this seems to imply is that one must be united in a person has to have a canonical status
yeah,
within this kind of organization, right? With this kind of governmentally structured unit,
sure.
right? And that's what I think kind of bothers people.
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's well, again, if you reduce communion to the juridical aspect, you reduce anything to the juridical aspect, and it's insufficient for satisfying our desire for justice and mercy and all those things. It really, it's got to be something more. But a lot of times
Yeah,
it's reduced to that. So,
right.
and
Well,
we know it is more.
it is more, right? It is more. But people get hung up on the juridical thing. The
Yeah.
problem is you kind of get hung up on the juridical thing because at the same time you can't just brush that aside,
Right. Right. It is
right? So
important.
that's where now here's where I think historically, right, the primacy of the juridical really becomes an issue is in
Hmm.
the thinking of Robert Bellarmine.
Yeah.
Now Robert Bellarmine isn't really the first guy here. But even before him, the Council of Florence, you had a strong emphasis on the juridical dimension of communion. Robert Bellarmine is in many ways picking up on that tradition.
Hmm.
But, he becomes kind of the premier ecclesiologist, right, in the post-Reformational period.
Sure.
And for Catholics in the West, right, the Protestant Reformation is probably the most, defining experience that the church will have had since the Great Schism,
Yeah.
right? So basically, right, the problem with Protestants, I mean, there are sort of many problems with Protestants. I'm not here to bash Protestants, but I'm just saying, of all the problems that we can kind of associate with the Protestant Reformation,
Hmm.
disagreements about what constitutes, what constitutes salvation and what are what's
Justification.
necessary for
Yeah.
what constitutes justification and all this kind of stuff. There are many serious disagreements, controversies that surround the Protestant Reformation, but we often neglect to consider the importance at the time of the dispute over the structure of the church,
Yeah.
how you actually thought about the church, what the church is. During the Protestant Reformation, right, many of the early confessions from the Protestant tradition emphasize ecclesiology very strongly. This is new to the Catholic tradition, right? I mean, when you go back to the creedal assertions that were made, say, in the first 7 ecumenical councils,
Yeah.
you have affirmations of the church, its apostolicity, its unity, its holiness. You don't have belabored definitions, right, of what the church is.
Yeah. You don't have Lumen Gentium or
Yeah, you don't have
anything
Lumen
to its
Gentium. That's right. So
equivalent.
Lumen Gentium is probably really the second document. Really, well, I mean, I think you've got with the Council of Trent and
Sure.
and again the First Vatican Council and finally Lumen Gentium. but this was all influenced by the problem that arose during the Protestant Reformation, where,
Mm-hmm.
when you decide that you're going to break away from the church, well, you better have an understanding of what the church is. Why? Well, because you're breaking away from a juridical structure, but you can't break away from the church and still think you're going to be saved.
Yeah.
Right? You see, and even the Protestants knew that, right? The Protestants understood that, and that's why they had to have statements about what the church is. So they could say, we're not leaving the church.
Right.
Right? What we are is the church. Okay? So once that issue was forced,
Mm-hmm.
naturally, the Catholic Church had to have its say about that. And Bellarmine is one of the most important voices during this period of time.
Mm-hmm.
So he comes with sort of this tripartite definition of the church,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where he says that the true church is the assembly of men gathered in the profession of the same Christian faith and in the same communion, right? In the communion of the same sacraments. Under the reign of legitimate pastors, and especially the one Vicar of Christ on earth, the Roman Pontiff. Right? So that's Bellarmine's definition
Yeah, so he gives
of the church.
three kind of criteria there: the profession of faith, the sacraments, and then subjection to the Pope.
Right. And that's the juridical dimension.
That's the juridical.
So, right. Now the problem is that this is going to become kind of the most important thing in Bellarmine's definition. I mean, it just sort of devolves to that. And we can talk about why, but it's interesting, and it turns out to be a little counterproductive in the long run. And this is one of the reasons why the 20th century, really actually even into the 19th century, from the 19th century, right, moving up through the middle of the 20th century and eventually to the Second Vatican Council, you see sort of modifications on the emphasis of the juridical dimension,
Mm-hmm.
right, in the hope of restoring some of the importance of the other two dimensions, right, the profession of faith and unity of the sacraments. So there are some strange things that happen because of the emphasis on the juridical, right?
Yeah.
And one of those is that it's possible, according to Bellarmine, that you could actually profess the correct faith and, you ready?
Yeah.
Actually celebrate valid sacraments and yet not be in the church. Right? So this is very, very interesting. And if you just think about, I mean, on the one hand, you might say, well, sure, that's true. I mean, what about these schismatics? Yeah, exactly, the schismatics. That's exactly the people he's talking about. The schismatics. But consider the strangeness of the hypothesis, right?
Yeah. Valid sacraments.
Valid sacraments and true faith outside the church. And one wonders then, right? If extra Ecclesiam nulla salus, right? If outside the church there's no salvation, does this mean that these people can celebrate the sacraments of salvation and yet they do them no good? I mean, what are the implications of this, right? And it's really troubling and odd.
Yeah, that is. Not gonna lie.
It's right. I mean, you can't get away from it. Well, it turns out, right, that actually popes addressed this issue, right? I mean, even in sort of the middle of I want to say the 1860s, this issue started to come up, and so there was reference to invincible ignorance, and by which they didn't mean that you were just a fool, right? What they meant was that that it sure seemed to you from where you were. I mean, you're an Eastern Orthodox dude.
Yeah.
Right? It sure seems to you from where you are that you've got things straight. We can't expect you to know otherwise, right?
Sure.
I mean, this is
Yeah, especially once
We can have
generations have gone down the
generations
line,
of
and
God. We
yeah,
can have long, heavy arguments, right, about where the points of disagreement lie. But these are arguments now that require expertise beyond even what most bishops would possess, right? So are we really going to say, and really, I mean, it just strikes one as bizarre
yeah, I don't know.
that
I don't know how to wrap my head around that.
like that sacraments could be invalid for generations upon generations and yet still be passed along, right? There
Yeah.
can be baptism, confirmation, Eucharist, ordination, and yet there is no church. That's just very, very strange, right?
Yeah, yeah. And it seems like a very unique kind of wound to the church that does exist, right? That you have this group that's so close. You know, they have
Yeah.
yeah, they have so much, but they're still lacking something. They're not in that full communion.
Right. So now, if you look at, let's jump into the middle of the 20th century, right? And you've got Pius the 12th.
Yeah.
And Pius the 12th, at the time of the Second World War, was very concerned, right, about the secular menace. I mean, the diabolical secularism of Nazi Germany and really, in the Soviet Union, even though they were, they were sort of uh, coalitional allies, right,
Sure.
against the Nazis, but they were still a massive problem for Christendom, right? And of course, I mean, it was a disaster in the world at the time of the Second World War for Christendom, and Pius XII was like, "All right, Christians." It's very interesting the way he writes, the De Mystici Corporis Christi, right?
Yeah.
He's addressing all Christians, not just Catholics, and he's talking even to Protestants, right? And he's like, "Look, people, um, we've got to take seriously now more than ever. I mean, the luxury of being able to be at odds with one another is past. This is not that time. We need to get our house in order. Christianity can't continue in this condition of fragmentation because the forces of darkness are arrayed against us. So much easier for them to tear us to pieces if we're already torn apart by ourselves."
Yeah.
Right? I mean, this is really his concern in Mystici Corporis Christi. And so he says, he wants to remind the Protestant world that they are recognized by the Catholic Church as Christian,
Mm-hmm. As
that
belonging to that mystical body. Yeah.
relationship with the church, in which he says they cannot be sure of their salvation. He doesn't say they're not saved.
Mm-hmm.
He says they cannot be sure of their salvation. And the reason is, interestingly, they lack many of the necessary aids to salvation that the church in her sacramental economy provides.
Yeah.
Right? So in the absence of the sacrament of reconciliation, for example, one is left to some alternative, right? Something other than sacramental grace, whereby the problem of sin is corrected after baptism, right? So basically, you commit a mortal sin, right? And maybe you never do. I mean, that's theoretically possible, right? Mortal
Sure.
sin is a choice. We have to choose to do it, right?
Yeah, you don't fall into it. I hate that language.
You don't just collapse into it, right? It, at some level, if it is a mortal sin, it does involve a deliberate choice, right?
Sure.
Okay, so it's possible you never do fall into a mortal sin, I guess, right? but lots of people do. And if you do, right, if that friendship with God is severed, and it's that friendship with God wherein we have the strength to turn to God. Why? Because we share in God's own inner life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this raises us above our merely natural condition, such that we can love God as he deserves to be loved, namely with the power of the love that comes from him, not from us. Right? So if that relationship is severed due to my turning away from God by choice, how does it get fixed? Right? Well, maybe God in his infinite mercy does manage to fix that for people, but
Sure.
he
But we don't
doesn't
know. We
tell
don't
us.
know. Yeah.
We don't know what he does, right? He reveals to us the sacramental economy on a need to know basis, right? This is what he ordains for us. And we know that that works, right? We know that that's going to get the job done. What else there might be if we should live apart from that economy?
Sure.
Only God knows the answer to that.
Yeah.
And, right?
Yeah, and a good Dominican professor of mine, he made the distinction that I always try to keep in mind as well, with regards to even just the sacraments. How do the sacraments work? We don't know. How do they work? How does baptism really unite you to the person of Christ? We don't really know exactly how that works, but we don't need to know that. What do we know, and what can we be absolutely sure of because Christ told us? Well, that baptism works.
Yeah, so here's what...
And I think that's super important to remember. The only way that we know to salvation is baptism. We know that works.
Let me say something here about the divine prerogative, if I might.
Sure.
Right. I think one of the important things, right, in resigning ourselves to the necessity of the sacraments, is to simply accept that they're ordained by Christ. Right. So in the divine prerogative, God chooses the sacramental economy for us to effect our salvation. Now, we can accept that, and once we accept it, we can meditate on it, and we can ask what wisdom is to be found there. We can explore the symbolism of the sacraments. We come to appreciate the richness of them. But that question about metaphysically how they actually achieve the thing we say they achieve, well, that's really simply because God so ordains it, right? But why does God ordain it? And I think the reason, there's a reason there's something we can say about that, even from our own human point of view, right? So I might say I don't know in God's wisdom why he chooses these things over others. But, I can find meaning in the things God chose. Could the sacramental economy have been otherwise? Probably. I guess, right? I can't say for sure they couldn't have been. But given that God gave it to us, right? Here's what I would say. It does seem to me that if he wants to effect unity where before there was division, it would stand to reason that he wants us to share something in common as concerns our ritual response toward him.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like that we worship him, we respond to him, right? We live our lives as response to him in a way that is, at least in its basic elements, recognizably unified. And that, I think, is where
and I would say a lot of that is also goes into God's mercy. It would be almost unfair to us if he said, I'll save you if you just baptize people, but I'm not really going to tell you how to do that. How do you have any surety of what it is that you're doing?
Right. You're saying
you can't.
he says, I want you, I want you to come up with sacraments pleasing to me or something, right? And you're like,
Yeah.
well, okay, but what sacraments would be pleasing to you?
How
Is this
many do
pleasing
we
to
need to
God?
have? Yeah.
Right. How many do we need to have? And um, right. And it seems to me actually that there are many Christians today who think that's exactly what God did.
Yeah. But I would say he did it because he knew us. He wanted to give us a sure way, and he did. And that's what we preach.
So think about it like this, right?
Yeah.
To the extent that I wish to depart from the sacramental life of the church,
Okay.
right? I want to go my own way on the sacramental economy, do things the way I want to do them, right? I'm I'm setting myself at odds from what all Christians historically have done,
Yeah.
right? So that's exactly the move in the wrong direction. If the whole point was that you're separate from others to begin with, that you're alienated, right? That you're just yourself and not the whole, then that move is exactly the wrong move, right?
Yeah.
The way,
But I think that's a very attractive position for a lot of modern people to be in because they don't like commitment. I want to be part of the church, but just the invisible church.
well, on
Because if
my
I'm
terms,
Yeah,
that's what it comes down
because if
to.
I'm part of a visible church, that probably means that I have duties and responsibilities, and I have to probably show some commitment to those people. And I don't like that.
And
So
I might have to obey someone,
yeah,
right? I mean, that's
or
another
be
part of it.
corrected, Yeah,
Be corrected, right, right. So I think,
that's
in Bellarmine's definition, you definitely can see that. I mean, the basic elements he outlines are not wrong,
yeah,
right? They're not wrong. But what happens is this weird thing about the schismatics who have the correct faith, uh, the true sacraments,
sure,
yet are not in juridical communion with the Pope.
yeah,
And a person could say, well, then they really don't have the true faith, because if they did, then they would know that they have to be in allegiance to the Pope, right? Um, yeah, I guess, except, when you talk to, it's not that Orthodox don't have their problems, right? But I mean, like, a lot of ink has been spilled over the decades since Ut Unum Sint,
yeah,
right? John Paul II's encyclical about the papacy. A lot of Eastern Orthodox theologians took him up on his invitation to rethink the implications of the Petrine primacy, right?
hmm,
And to be honest with you, while it's true that there are certain dogmatic assertions that have to be made about papal primacy, namely that it's a real thing, there are many open questions about it,
sure,
right? What actually are its practical implications in our daily lives? How far does it reach dogmatically, right? I mean, like, the kinds of questions um, about when ex cathedra statements are made, how we determine that, et cetera, right? I
yeah,
mean, there's no formal list of ex cathedra statements uttered by popes. Um, the condi- the conditions of an ex cathedra statement, right? They're outlined in the First Vatican Council document, right?
outlined, yeah, but
But when you actually try to apply them, is this an ex cathedra statement? Is that an ex? Could a pope make an ex cathedra statement like this one or like that one?
yeah,
Get into some very interesting and open questions,
sure,
right? That are really, I mean, unresolved, right? Some unresolved issues.
yeah,
So there's still a great deal to talk about, and so, if you're an Eastern Orthodox guy, you might actually hold the position, as many do, right? Many do
hmm,
hold the position that, I mean, I could show you the articles from in the 10-year period that followed Unum Sint. probably 50% of the articles in the English language Eastern Orthodox journals. And I don't think I'm exaggerating. Probably about half the articles were about papal primacy or some aspect of it.
Interesting. Yeah.
And so there are a great many Eastern Orthodox theologians who would recognize that there's something about the Bishop of Rome.
Sure.
And that there's some sort of need to be in communion with him, right? And they might dispute whether indeed they are sufficiently in communion with him, right?
Yeah.
In other words, if their condition, if their current juridical state satisfies the minimum requirements, right, of being in communion with the Bishop of Rome.
Yeah.
I mean, look,
count? Yeah.
they're no longer regarded as excommunicate.
Yeah.
Right? They're not regarded as excommunicate, right? So what exactly does that mean? Are they in communion or not?
Well, if they're
not excommunicate, does that mean they're in communion?
Right?
I don't know. Well, from the perspective of the sacramental economy,
sure,
then you would say they are, right? So if they have a true faith, they would profess the very same creed we would profess, right? So basically, in the sense of broad orthodoxy, they would profess the very same faith in God, the Father Almighty, creator of heaven and earth, and Jesus Christ, his only Son, right? They would confess the very same faith.
Mm-hmm.
They have the same sacraments and view them, except in perhaps the finer details, right? Mm-hmm. They view them as essentially the same realities that we accept them to be.
Yeah.
Right? And when it comes to the Eucharist, right, we would say, it is indeed the true body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. They would say that too.
Sure.
So if we're in communion with Jesus Christ in and through Eucharistic communion, and so are they, because in fact they have the true sacrament, right? Well, how many Jesus Christs are there? There's only one.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, right, we're one in Jesus Christ. We are indeed one in Jesus Christ. That's right. So that's the crystallization point between, that's the point of intersection really between what's called koinonia ecclesiology, mm-hmm. right, communion ecclesiology, and Eucharistic ecclesiology.
Yeah.
Right. So in Catholic and Orthodox thinking, the two really belong together.
Yeah.
We do still have disagreements here between Catholics and Orthodox on the implications of sharing the reality of Holy Eucharist. But I think what we do recognize is that there's an essential link between Eucharistic ecclesiology and koinonia ecclesiology.
Yeah.
Whereas from a Protestant point of view, right, the sacraments don't have the same significance as instruments of salvation, as media of salvation, right? And so there's affirmation of the true faith. There's mm-hmm. true belief. And they might say true worship, but we would have disagreements on what true worship entailed.
Sure. So right? So if you're looking at Bellarmine's kind of three criteria there of profession of faith, sacraments, and recognizing the Pope, the juridical aspect that we have been talking about. So the Orthodox, then, they're lacking that juridical aspect. Protestants, and we would say, would be definitely lacking the juridical aspect, but also the sacramental aspect. Well, part of the sacramental aspect, because we do recognize a lot of Protestant baptisms. So they have that one sacrament, and for the most part, the same profession of faith, unless, until you start getting into the many different denominations and actually seeing, if some of them have some sort of Christological heresies or something like that. But for the most part, they would have that profession of faith,
Right. So if you're basically talking about, if you're talking about, sort of, again, we'll use the phrase broadly orthodox. Um, right. So this is a term that you'll hear Protestants use.
Sure.
And you know the Protestants that we're talking about, right? I mean, we're talking about Westminster Confession type Reformed
Yeah.
thinkers, right? Or, like Missouri Synod Lutheran types, right? Where they would, what I mean is they will profess they'll profess the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed and
Sure.
mean by it mostly the same thing that we do,
Yeah.
right? That it's recognizably the same faith, the same God, the incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're talking about Protestants like that, then yeah, we're going to recognize their baptism as valid.
Yeah.
I mean, there are some very interesting questions actually about what happens when, what if you don't believe that baptism is in fact salvific, right? Like the
Yeah.
Baptists don't really believe that baptism is salvific. It's commanded by God, and so they do it, but they don't believe that it causes
Real
salvation or
effects.
constitutes
Yeah.
one as a Christian. That's an interesting issue. So far in the history of the church, there hasn't been a judgment that invalidates the sacrament, which is it's fascinating to me. But I mean, we could sit here and talk about that, but that's a whole other conversation, probably.
Sure. Now let's look at maybe where does morality fit into this, because this is always something that comes up with regards to talking about being in communion with the church. Would that fall under profession of faith, I guess?
Well, yes and no.
Yeah.
Right. So I think we can say that faithful Christians, I mean, by faithful here, I mean Christians who believe rightly,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they have sort of the supernatural habit of faith, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay. Nonetheless, in our condition, this side of the parousia, we have this problem, right? And that is that we are strongly tempted to sin. And it's true that grace helps us to persevere against sin.
Mm-hmm.
But most of us know from our personal experience that unless you might be some sort of extraordinarily gifted person, I don't mean gifted as in sort of smart or something. I mean like God has given you some special
Infused.
grace.
Yeah.
Right, some infused grace that like you're John the Baptist or Jeremiah or somebody. Unless that has happened, you experience temptation in the course of life. Sometimes it's rather strong, and under the weight of that temptation, sometimes people sin. So saying that, right? Episodic sin
Mm-hmm.
is found in the church, and in fact, we have a sacrament to deal with that. We've already
Sure.
talked about that, right? So the church recognizes this is a thing, and we've got a sacrament to address it. But if you say that you're talking about somebody who simply rejects the moral teaching of the church, right?
Yeah, or just habitual, unrepented sin.
Yeah, I think what's happening at a certain point, right? What's happening is you simply have rejected the faith. That basically, there's a point at which, I mean, you could have maybe some severe cognitive dissonance or something, right? Where you just choose to put it out of your mind. And maybe if I asked you, you would recognize that this is a sin, and that it's a habitual part of your life, to which you've sort of given up any resistance. But that could be the case, right? That could be the case. In which case, I might say you still have faith, but there is obviously a defect in your faith, right? A pretty severe defect, because there's a radical disconnect between your behavior and what you claim to believe.
Yeah.
And there's something about being rational, right? That makes that living in that condition very difficult for us.
Yeah, well, that's what I was thinking. That's what I was thinking about, like with looking at, Bellarmine's, 3 points here, like, the person who's living in that, again, because it's mortal sin, they're doing it with full knowledge, so I'm assuming full knowledge and all that stuff, full consent. But it's as if they're, denying the sacrament, or not cooperating, at the very most, not cooperating with the sacramental grace.
Yeah, that's
They
for
are
sure.
maybe denying some aspect of the faith, or, like you said, have some kind of deficient, whether it be in their will when they're professing the faith, or something in their intellect, while they're, whether it be, some kind of ignorance that they should probably invincible. But even then, when it comes to the juridical, almost a setting aside of, I don't care about the juridical
Yeah.
aspect.
So,
It's almost
if you
like a
think about,
rejection, like the moral problem I see is kind of a pushback against almost all three of those,
yeah, it can
saying,
be, and I think
yeah,
often it is. So I want to distinguish between sort of the weakness that you find in many people, right?
yeah,
Where there's temptation to sin. It's difficult to live in the face of this temptation that never seems to go away, and so many
sure,
people sort of give into it. They resign themselves to it. It's a bad state,
yeah,
but it's somewhat understandable, and it doesn't necessarily mean that the person lacks faith. It does kind of indicate that the person, I mean, there's something desperately wrong that needs to be addressed, but it doesn't necessarily mean he lacks faith. He might
mhm,
still recognize that what he does is evil, right?
yeah,
Maybe he loses hope, but not necessarily faith. Um, what I find really remarkable today is what, and I've been sort of working on a series here for CSA, a bit slow on it, but this idea of an invisible schism,
hmm,
that in the church today, there are people who seem to seem to confess something that isn't Christianity. I mean, they would they could pray the very same prayers.
hmm,
Uh, they could be sitting next to me in mass. They could profess the same creed, but the way they interpret the words that they're saying, I'm convinced, is not the same. And I think that we can see evidence of this when we see people who, in the name of Christianity, in the name of their Catholic faith, right,
yeah,
will say, because I'm Catholic, I advocate for abortion or for, contraception for everybody,
sure,
something like that. And this is clearly the case. I mean, we see this among Catholic politicians in Congress and soon perhaps in the White House, right? I mean, we see this very thing, these people who are
yeah,
juridically Catholic, right? But whatever it is, they think, how can I put this? If they think that the Catholic Church commands that abortion be made available to everyone, right? That abortion is a positive social good to be ensured by the government,
enshrined, yeah,
right? Uh, or that gender theory, right, is a good to be recognized and to be celebrated by society, right? Not just that we shouldn't, sort of do bad things to people who have those experiences, but that we should advance the way of thinking that affirms it as an authentic way
right,
of being human, or
and
something. That this is
instill it in our laws, yeah,
instill
that's,
in our laws and punish people for not assenting to it, right? Whatever it is that you believe, if that's the case,
yeah,
I don't recognize it as Catholicism,
yeah,
right?
and in some cases Christianity, like you said,
Or even
is,
Christianity. So, all right, do you see what I'm saying? It's like that if you say it's my Catholicism that leads me to these conclusions. And I'm going to say, if that's true, then your Catholicism and my Catholicism are not the same thing at all. And so we have this weird phenomenon of actually being juridically in the same church, maybe even sacramentally in the same church, right? But we don't actually share the same faith.
Yeah.
That's very strange, right?
Yeah. I mean, it reminds me of the great line of The Princess Bride, right? You keep using that word. I don't I don't think it means what you think it means.
Yeah, right.
It's
right.
but like you said, it's that, and this is where I think, with regards, especially here in America, when we talk about communion, many times on both sides, we can, whether it be the liberal politician or even the conservative Catholic, we can reduce it sometimes to the juridical.
Yes.
The liberal Catholic can simply say, well, I haven't been excommunicated, therefore I'm a Catholic in good standing. Where it's like, well, no, you're not. Because the juridical, you can't reduce communion to just the juridical. You have to look at all the different aspects, the profession of faith, the sacraments. And, some denominations are different, but, if you're a professing Catholic, that means that you are in full communion with the church, which means you profess the same, you make that public profession of faith. And what you mean by it is what the church means by it. And that's a key, I think that's a key part of the understanding of when we make that profession of faith. When I say, I believe in Jesus Christ, that's not me saying I believe in, a
very important man in
history.
history.
The greatest philosopher or something like that. No.
Yeah.
I believe, in what the church believes. And that's, and again, that's also how, when we enter into communion with the church, it's not, I don't go off and write my own creed, or I don't do these things on my own, but I assimilate myself. I bring I submit myself, my intellect, to that which has gone before us. But like you said, for people to, it's one thing for a Catholic to espouse a position like abortion or contraception for all or something like that. That's one thing. But for them to justify their espousing to that by their Catholic faith, I mean, that's taking it to, I think, a whole new level with regards to, like, okay, hang on, we got to back the train up. What do you mean then when you say these things?
It's bizarre. And I would say that our current crisis, as far as this goes, is a holdover from Bellarmine's influence, right? So, and I'm not saying it to bash Bellarmine. Bellarmine is great.
Yeah.
But, and if you get what it was that he was trying to address,
sure,
then you see what the importance of the definition that he applied. But when we misapply that definition in the current context, we have problems, right? So our inability to deal with the obvious, persistent heresy that governs the decision making of so-called Catholic politicians, right?
Mm-hmm.
Our inability to actually deal with this and decide that they can't be admitted to communion.
Yeah.
And there's clear disagreement among the bishops on this issue, right? That's they just don't agree on how to deal with it.
Yeah.
That you would say, I'm going to admit him to communion, suggests that you're kind of radicalizing the juridical element.
Yeah. Well, yeah, exactly. Or you're reducing communion to simply this juridical
he
element.
Identifies as Catholic. He's in the parish registry, right? So so here's what Bellarmine says, right? So there's the tripartite definition, right? Profession of the true faith, the communion of the sacraments, and subjection to the legitimate shepherd, the Roman Pontiff. By reason of the first part, right, the profession of faith, all infidels are excluded from the church, right?
Mm-hmm.
both those who were never in the church, such as Jews, Turks, and pagans, and those who were and went back, such as heretics and apostates, by which he means here formal heretics, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Those who have been tried as heretics and convicted. By reason of the second part, catechumens, so this is sacramental communion.
Yeah.
Catechumens and excommunicates are excluded. Catechumens are excluded from the church, which is interesting because we bury catechumens in the church.
Yeah.
Right? All right, so catechumens are excluded from the church as well as excommunicates. The former because they are not admitted to the communion of the sacraments, and the latter because they are cast out.
Mm-hmm.
By reason of the third part, namely juridical communion. By reason of the third part, are excluded schismatics who have faith and sacraments, but are not subject to the legitimate pastors, and therefore they profess the faith and receive the sacraments outside the church. But listen to this. This is the part that's really interesting. All others are included, even the reprobate, the wicked, and the impious. And that's kind of where we are right now, I think, with, the Nancy Pelosi's and Joe Biden's of the world. That's what I see.
Yeah.
Right.
That's
now
interesting.
But this is where, so again, going back to the Protestant Reformation as the context,
Yeah,
with it to understand what he's talking about, he points out the difference between his opinion and the opinions of others. Right.
Mm-hmm.
The Protestants placed heavy emphasis on the internal virtues that constitute a person as a member of the church.
Yeah.
Right. And on account of which they make the church invisible. That's the problem, right? Bellarmine wants to be able to say, there's the church. I know I'm in communion with the church. I know I'm in the church. I can identify where the church is.
Yeah.
Right? And I'm in that. But the Protestants had a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
If outside the church there's no salvation, there is a worrisome issue here if the church is invisible.
Yeah.
How do I know I'm in it? Right? And that's what Bellarmine is trying to deal with. So I think I think what we just have to do is to say, look, I mean, true faith and communion in the sacraments, well, communion in the sacraments, that's pretty visible.
Sure.
And true faith is something that I can identify at least in indirect ways, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the public profession of faith is a huge part of the Easter Vigil for those coming into the church.
Yeah,
that's
right.
One of the main parts of that Mass is that public profession of faith.
Right.
It's huge.
And I can't simply thumb my nose at the authority structure of the church, right? I have to submit to that. So really, I think we have to say that for Bellarmine, all three elements here have to be recognized as important.
Yeah, and to understand that there is such a thing as this partial communion,
right? And that's right,
which is again kind of it's muddy. Nothing is very clear
and uncomfortable. But that's where the church goes in the course of the 19th and 20th centuries.
Sure.
To the recognition of this imperfect communion.
Yeah.
Now, what we want is the perfect communion. We want a person to profess the true faith, to be in communion with the sacraments, and to be subject to the lawful authority of the church established by Christ in communion with the Roman Pontiff. That's what we want.
Yeah. Right? And that should be a big aim for us with regards to evangelization. We don't want to preach people to kind of a mere Christianity, but we want to bring them into this full communion of the church.
That's right. So basically, I think we have to say, according to the teaching of the church as it unfolded in the 19th and 20th centuries, there's something to be said about Lewis's concept of mere Christianity.
Yeah.
right? That is a reality. Is it an all-sufficient reality? No.
No. Yeah.
It's not where we want to stop. And C.S. Lewis didn't think so either.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
It's not where we want to stop. And the Catholic Church has a clear idea of where we ought to go, right? Namely, into the full sacramental economy of the Church and juridical communion with the successor of Peter in the Bishop of Rome.
Mm-hmm.
But those who truly profess the name of Christ are Christians, and those who've been baptized in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, right, and profess the name of Christ are Christians. And those who, and the Orthodox, right, are members of the Church, right? I mean, even though the language is very strong, that they're recognized, they're recognized as being part of the Catholic tradition.
Yeah.
But still, we need to keep pressing forward.
Yeah.
Until the unity that Christ desired, the unity that really brings humanity back together again.
Yeah.
Is realized.
Yeah. And that's what's about salvation. And like you said, the whole thing with communion is begins with original sin, the destruction of it. And so what we're trying to do with evangelization and with everything we do as our church is that solution, because we are united to the person of Christ, and that's where we want to bring people.
Right. So imperfect communion is never going to be the stopping point.
Yeah.
It's a starting point for Christians now.
Yeah.
It's not where we end up.
Yeah, exactly. All right, Dr. Bulzacchelli, I think you've given our listeners a lot to think about, and hopefully some people will go out there and research a little more and check out Robert Bellarmine's writings and what he has to say on this, and just even exploring the topic of communion in the church in that way. I want to point all of our listeners to go check out all of our content over at CatholicStudiesAcademy.com. Be sure to look at all of our free stuff, but also know we have a lot of courses. Dr. Bulzacchelli's just finished up one on ecclesiology, and he has several others on sacred scripture, fundamental theology. And the whole goal of Catholic Studies Academy is to get people to study the Catholic faith in both philosophy and theology together, because they serve each other. Actually, philosophy serves theology, but I won't tell Dr. Smith you said that, but this is how the church wants us to study the arts. And so this is how we're trying to present it here at Catholic Studies Academy. So I want to invite everybody to go check us out over there. And in the meantime, God bless.